Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jenna Zerker, and I am part of our marketing and communications team here at Insight Partners. And today we're going to be talking about what founders need to know about responsible AI. So before we dive in, I just have a few housekeeping things that I want to bring up for everybody. So first thing is that the session is being recorded. So if you'd like to share this with someone else after, we hope that you will. We'll be sending the recording to you within the next, probably about sometime early next week. So keep an eye out on that in your inbox. If you have any questions, there is an open Q&A chat box. So be sure to submit them into there. You guys can upvote each other's questions. So if there's something you really want to get answered, make sure you guys are upvoting each other's. We also received a lot from you guys in advance, and we wove those throughout today's discussion. So we're really excited to address those. And then one last thing for housekeeping is there's a survey at the end. So please take a second, fill that out. Really helps us ensure we're giving you the best content possible. Now, in case you guys haven't heard, before we begin, I do want to remind everyone that we have Scale Up AI happening next month. It's October 27th, and we already have 1,000 people registered, and we hope that you guys can join us too. We're including 50% off virtual passes for everyone who's attending today. So use the promo code or use responsible AI 50, type that in when you register for 50% off. I'm going to be pasting this information into the chat. So if you guys don't have a second to scan right now, no worries, that's going to be made available for you. So from here, I'm going to pass it to Jenna to get us started.
Thank you. Well, I'm very excited to be here today to have the opportunity to dive into responsible AI landscape with my partners here. To introduce myself, I'm Jenna Zerker, and I'm a VP here at Insight, spending a lot of my time in AI, data, and infrastructure, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel. So to kick it off, if you aren't familiar with Insight Partners, we have been investing in software for over 25 years, and particularly relevant for this conversation in AI, and are now partners to over 600 transformative portfolio companies. We also have over 20 billion under management, and with that flexibility really to invest in software across stages. And now, given all of that, we want to leverage that experience today in both software investing and AI and share how, as a result, we see responsible AI really transforming the future of software. And we have seen regulation really impact a myriad of end markets and that we've invested in. And we now have been laser focused on understanding similarly how regulation and responsible AI will not only impact founders, but the AI landscape overall. So today we will introduce the panel, and then we will dive into a few key areas that we think are particularly relevant for this discussion, and then open it up to all of you for questions. So with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers today, George, Nikhil, and John. And I will pass it over to you to share your backgrounds.
Thanks, Jenna. My name is George Mathew. I'm one of the partners at Insight, been here about 3 years now, predominantly focused on investing in all things related to the modern data stack, ML ops, and of course now the emergence of LLM ops, and of course generative AI. As a background of what Jenna had indicated with Insight, we have been very much long, not only on software, but of course investing in AI. We currently have about 4 billion of investments between Nikhil, myself, and other partners who have actually worked on the progress of what we're seeing in this market, particularly in the last half a decade. Looking forward to this conversation with everyone at this webinar.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for joining the session with us today. I'm Nikhil. I'm one of the managing directors at Insight. I joined the firm 4 years ago and have predominantly focused on venture and growth stage investing in the software landscape with more of a tighter focus on modern horizontal applications and applications that touch some of the larger verticals like life sciences and financial services. Have had the pleasure to work with my partners here on both defining our landscape and emerging theses around AI, which I think is taking this whole sector by storm, as well as with a lot of my portfolio companies who either are AI native companies like Wizard, which are bringing AI to design, or Viz.ai, which is bringing AI to a clinical setting, and those that are application companies now quickly looking to evolve their offerings to consumers by incorporating AI.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm John Weinstein. I'm Deputy General Counsel here at Insight. I cover and support our business and the business of our portfolio companies in a number of different ways. But one key way is in transforming our businesses to be ready for the next chapter of AI and AI integration into how we operate and how our portfolio companies operate. I've personally found, both personally and professionally, the development of AI legislation and regulation here in the US and around the world to be one of the most fascinating topics to watch unfold. That may be in part because I'm a little bit of a legal geek, but I'm hoping to share a few of the highlights of that with you today, as well as some practical tips around how to comply in a very uncertain landscape.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. So to kick it off and really set the stage, Nikhil, I'd love to get your perspective on how you define responsible AI and why really it matters today, both as it relates to the tech landscape, but also founders.
Yeah, I'll start with maybe just setting some context on why we're even having this discussion. And we're having this discussion around responsible AI because while AI has been evolving for a long time, we've really seen a step function change in the frenzy of innovation around AI, in the incredible adoption and evolution of applications and tooling. And we're admittedly in, I think, peak hype cycle around this, but there's a reason for that. I think we're seeing that there are a number of applications to use AI to improve building companies and delivering customer value. And we at Insight have spent a lot of time not only thinking about where we want to make net new investments in this landscape, and we'll talk about our stack in a minute, but also talking to our portfolio companies about how to approach incorporating AI into your business. And I think there are two frameworks. One is product strategy. So how can you make your products better by embedding and building generative AI capabilities into your product, or allow for easy integration of generative AI tools that improve the value to your customer, they improve the workflows. That's step one. Step two is really reimagining your product roadmaps to think about the ways that generative AI could disrupt your business in new ways, or deliver customer values in new ways. And then third is really look at the data that you are capturing, or the data that is unique to you in your interaction with your customers, because they will enable you to build more and more defensibility in your product. The second is really in how you think about scaling a business. I think AI, to different degrees, is applicable to a lot of companies that want to innovate and evolve their product set. It's probably applicable to almost all companies if you want to do things like make your interactions with customers easier by using customer chatbots, use coding copilots to improve engineering output, or do things like draft marketing content more quickly by using tools like Writer or Jasper, which are our portfolio companies. And I think already, even though we're at the ground floor of this innovation, our portfolio companies are seeing the value. Our companies at large are seeing the value, and there's a lot of adoption. And so it raises the question of, okay, there's a lot of benefit here, but business leaders, I think, are starting to ask not just how do we adopt AI, but how do we adopt AI in a way that is safe, reliable, and aligned with human values. We think of responsible AI as referring to the ethical development and the use of artificial intelligence systems that involves transparency, fairness, accountability, privacy protection, security, and human-centered design, really to ensure that AI benefits society without causing harm or loss. That's a pretty all-encompassing definition, and I want to just break it into three components. One is technical. And I think this is applicable to generative AI. It's also applicable to a lot of software and technology, which is, how do you define and understand and manage the risks in areas like data privacy and security. The second two are more what I would call socio-technical risk, and these are issues related to bias, fairness, model interpretability, and explainability. And I think that's a lot of what we're going to touch on in this presentation today. And then the third bucket is more social. We're actually not going to address this in this presentation today, but the risk associated with maybe building human relationships with AI, or some of the risks of incorporating AI and what that might mean for not just workforce productivity, but also workforces overall.
And that makes a ton of sense and is super helpful in just kind of setting the foundation for the conversation today. I think as you support founders, both that are software and AI first kind of portfolio company founders, I'm curious how you think about advising them around, which AI risks are really most important in terms of where they should be focusing today.
Yeah, I think, and maybe it's helpful to just go to the next slide, which defines our stack. I think it depends on where in this stack you're playing, and or where in the stack you're adopting certain tool sets. So this is how we think about the AI landscape. Broadly, there are 4 sections here. One are the foundation models. OpenAI would be a great example here of a foundation model. The one layer up is a domain-specific model. So you have access to some proprietary vertical data, and you build a domain-specific LLM targeted around a certain vertical. Third is a broad set of tooling that you might use in the development or deployment of LLMs or generative AI applications. And then the fourth layer is actually, what are all the apps? I think we see companies trying to build net new businesses in each of these sectors. We also see a number of companies looking to work with different parts of the stack, whether it's working with an OpenAI or working with one of the applications that sit at the top layer of the stack. I think some of the things to be cognizant about are, well, what is the data that you're accessing, holding, or using, and how sensitive is that? I think in an area like marketing content, the sensitivity around what your output is and the explainability is maybe less of an issue than, let's say, you were working with personal health information or making critical decisions around care, as it relates to using AI to do that. Or if you're making decisions around, let's say, approving a loan application. I think there's a lot of concern in regulated industries like that around, are you seeing that there is some sort of bias, and how can you understand and explain bias that's going into these applications?
Super helpful. And I guess on that note, now we've talked about the key risks. Obviously, that goes hand in hand with how regulation is evolving. So, John, as our expert here, I'd love to get your perspective on kind of the overview of the regulatory environment for AI today, and what global policies founders should be focused on as it relates to thinking about responsible AI.
Sure. So this is honestly a little bit of a bear of a topic for one webinar, let alone just a short segment of one. But why don't I set the stage with painting a bit of the picture for what's influencing and what's characterizing the current regulatory debate. First, I think it's notable that government bodies everywhere around the world and even within the United States are working on this in a fairly uncoordinated way. I'm confident that there will be some natural processes for coordination that come out of this, but there may end up with some challenging conflicts depending on where you operate and at what levels. The regulatory effort is being led by people who are relatively uneducated and unfamiliar with the technology, which I think is creating challenges for being able to move quickly and adopt smart regulation in an efficient manner. And then just this general sense that we're dealing with something really high stakes here. I think of the major geopolitical powers within the world, I think there's a shared sense that AI can't be over-regulated because there are massive implications, economic, social, public health, even national security implications for stifling competition and innovation and hamstringing your country. And then there's also massive implications for under-regulating or regulating the wrong way, where some serious risks or harms to individuals or countries or the world at large can permit themselves to play out. So with that kind of hanging in the background, I've seen there being three main players within the regulatory debate and development to date. China, the European Union, and of course the United States. I'll start with the United States. The United States is obviously the one that is most relevant for most of us. We all have we're either based here or have some presence within the United States. I think what I initially said, it certainly rings true that things here are fairly uncoordinated. Congress has a number of different work streams underway. The White House has a number of different work streams underway. Various different executive agencies at the federal level have initiatives underway. Multiple different states are trying to individually tackle this. And then layered on top of all of that, you have a court system that's trying to interpret existing laws in the context of these novel applications, and in the process developing what becomes case law. I do think that there's some real signs of optimism, though. Like I said, I do think that there's a shared view that this is very important and high stakes. And my sense is that bipartisanship, which I think infects almost everything that our country's lawmakers do these days, really does not seem to have expanded into the AI space in the same way as so many other areas, which I think is really important to getting something done and having it come out in a really sensible format. And as I said, I think that there is an education gap. But I think that there's some really serious efforts underway to educate lawmakers very quickly, because everybody kind of appreciates the high stakes nature of this. I think the most important area for U.S. regulation right now is sitting in Congress. Congress is sort of the kingmaker in all of this. Congress can preempt state laws that may get adopted. Congress can override whatever the federal agencies do, and assuming that they don't run into a conflict with the U.S. Constitution, Congress can also override court decisions. So I think Congress is probably the most important place to look right now. There's a number of different AI-focused bills that have been put forward, none of which have gotten great traction today. One particularly important educational initiative underway is Senator Chuck Schumer's policy forums. He's been inviting a mix of lawmakers, academics, and private sector professionals in to discuss AI in an open forum and try and get as educated as possible on this topic. And I think the main questions that Congress is grappling with, and I think most legislators around the world are grappling with, are the following. One, should we have a new AI-focused regulatory body? Or should we have AI regulated by existing regulators, each with a different sub-focus within AI? Two, should models need to get licensed before they're released? If so, which kinds of models, and what is that license? What do those licensing protocols look like, and how do we keep the burdens low enough that we don't stamp out some of the important innovation at the smaller scale of the industry. 3 is who should be liable for problems with the model. So misinformation, civil rights violations, privacy violations, the like. Who's ultimately responsible when a model makes mistakes? Are there any use cases that should be banned completely? I've heard people talk about the decision as to whether to launch a nuclear weapon. That one, feels like a pretty obvious candidate for AI just should not be making that decision. What use cases should have higher bars for safety? And things in this category have included things like critical infrastructure, hiring and firing decisions, law enforcement, and what particular regulations or compliance burdens do we place upon them? Should we throttle compute at some level and use computing power as some sort of a proxy for model dangerousness? And then lastly, what do penalties for non-compliance look like? And so I think those are really going to form the core of almost every legislative agenda that develops in this space. And you've seen that play out in the European Union, for example, which probably has the most advanced AI-related regulation of its kind at the current time. The EU AI Act does take the sort of tiered approach that I was discussing, where there are some things that are just outright banned. One example from the EU AI Act is real-time facial recognition in public places, social scoring systems, things like that. They have higher risk categories and then minimal risk categories where it's mostly around transparency and making sure users actually understand that they're interfacing with AI. I think notable about the EU AI Act is it has a couple things. One, it has incredibly broad reach. So even if you are a model provider and user that's based entirely outside of the EU, if what you're developing with the AI is intended for use within the European Union, it will still be swept up into the EU AI Act, which has implications for people and businesses around the world. Second, it has extremely severe penalties, which are percentage of revenue based and uncapped, so can become incredibly expensive for companies that are not in compliance with it. And there aren't any extra safety burdens on compute power, which I thought was interesting in contrast to, for example, California, which has also taken a lead step in developing its own AI regulation, but has based their risk scheme on computing power. And then the last one I'll touch on just briefly is China. I don't think that there are a lot of cases in which we or our portfolio companies will need to comply with Chinese AI regulations, but I do think that it has big implications for technological competition and geopolitics between China and the Western world. And I also think it's interesting just to see how they've done it. Their general approach has been to be extremely broad and really focus on censorship and ensuring that the story, if you will, of the PRC and the incumbent government is not conflicted by or challenged by any AI systems. So rather than kind of a broad-based safety mandate, it looks like the focus was a little bit more inward toward protecting China and the Chinese government, which I thought was interesting. But I've already taken up, I think, a bit too much time on this topic, so I'll hand it back to you.
No, as you said, there is so much to dig into here, and you did such an amazing job at really giving us that foundation of the regulation landscape that exists. I think given that, George, it would be great to get your thoughts on, given this wave of forthcoming regulation, how is the tech industry reacting, and what kinds of governance solutions are emerging that founders should be aware of? And I think as you dive into that question, the next slide would be helpful in kind of setting the scene here.
Yeah, and before we even go to the next slide, just to stay on this one for a second, there's a number of things that I'll highlight in the next slide, really about alignment, safety, trust, and just overall management of models as they're coming into production, which we'll spend a good degree of time on. There's even before that, in the foundation models themselves, what's really exciting to hear and see, as John was indicating a few points, particularly in terms of how we think about model regulation, is this notion of constitutional AI. Right. And so Anthropic introduced this idea as one of the foundation model builders just about 3-4 months ago to think through ways that there is human guardrails effectively on how models get trained and models come into production. And so the idea there is you write out a constitution of the principles that an AI system can or cannot abide by. And then interestingly, you're using a feedback loop system, whether it be what's basically known as an RLHF, a reinforcement learning through an AI feedback loop, to be able to bootstrap and basically understand, is the system as it's in production effectively keeping to those guardrails themselves, right? So we're seeing this not only in the things that I'll just cover in a moment, in the sort of trust, safety, and alignment systems that are called outside of the foundation models and the sort of AI models in general, but it's also now being incorporated pretty excitingly into the foundation models themselves. And probably Anthropic's work around constitutional AI is one of those great examples. In the next slide, what I just wanted to highlight then is just this idea, if we think about this build chain today, and how does, as Nikhil indicated, this need for trust, safety, and alignment kind of play through, and where the marketplace is today in terms of really helping a founder and enterprise software business really get through the considerations and how to sort of support that in the platforms and the tools that are available to you today. When first and foremost, if I highlight what's happening, it's clear that the foundation model builders and some of the key AI platforms and hyperscalers themselves have introduced these capabilities directly in a general purpose manner. And as that has occurred over the last several years, we're seeing the broader, what's basically known as the governance, risk, and compliance providers in this space, the GRC providers, introduce those capabilities simultaneously. So OneTrust is one of the key investments that we had made a few years back. I recently invested into a company called Skyflow. A number of identity management capabilities around Big ID and others have introduced the notion that you can deliver the governance, risk, and compliance specifically around your AI systems embedded into, call it, a focused and targeted effort around governance, risk, and compliance, and more broadly in the GRC platforms that are already in market. Alongside of that, we've now seen this emergence of what's basically the best of breed products and players in this space. And of course, the journey started early on with the model monitoring, the observability. So the idea there is that you have models in production, you want to understand what the model performance is there drift, is there bias detection, is there fairness in models? And so over the years, the observability providers have been doing a tremendous job here. We invested in a company called Fiddler, Arise, Truera, others have certainly, Arthur AI have done incredible work here as well. As we're seeing this evolution, there's this sort of new space that's emerging, which is, Jenna, to your point around just pure AI governance. And this is an area that we're really excited by at Insight. And there's a number of key players that have emerged. Credo AI has taken some of the things that John has indicated in terms of the emergence of regulatory frameworks and kind of embedded that into a very GRC focused, compliance oriented, risk management oriented system that keeps track of all those changes that are ongoing in local, state, government, and sort of global AI regimes, and introduces that directly into a way that you can now administer that risk and compliance inside your organization. A number of other key players over the years, more recently, have emerged in this sort of topical focus area around AI governance. All of this is really telling us that this is probably one of the hottest and actually most important topics as we think about getting AI systems into production at scale. This is the moment here, I believe, that's going to critically define, in a lot of ways, how software, and particularly AI-based software, is delivered into production in the next several years, perhaps even decade. And the systems that are involved in this are, quite profound, but also quite capable of really helping enterprises as well as startups, as they're building their AI systems, really understand how to make sure that they're within the guardrails necessary to produce responsible AI over the coming years.
Thank you for that. That was incredibly helpful. I guess on that note, as you think about the regulatory landscape and everything that has evolved there and is evolving, and you think about what else is kind of rapidly evolving within AI, we know that MLOps and LLMOps has also been rapidly evolving. And so I'm really curious, given that context, how you see the role of MLOps and LLMOps as it relates to playing in AI governance.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that, because I think the capabilities of machine learning operations, which has been defined for quite a few years in terms of being able to do all the experiment tracking and parameter tuning and version controls and just kind of keeping track of how models are performing. It's an area that we, of course, invested into with one of the key leaders in the space, and Weights and Biases, has continued to evolve from, as you stated, MLOps into LLM Ops, Jenna. And what is the key sort of differences that we're seeing in the emergence of these capabilities for LLM operations? What we're seeing first and foremost is that this idea that you have transfer learning really being the heart and center of the systems at scale is quite important. And when you think about what's happening with transfer learning, it's that the models themselves have a certain amount of human reasoning, human-like reasoning, that can bring in that human-like reasoning from one problem domain to the other. And really, that's what has been beautiful about the transformers and large language models in general, that they have this ability to transfer learn from one problem domain to the next. The next thing, and we might want to go to the next slide, is this idea that there's actually just a lot more compute involved, right? When you think about the compute that's involved in this emergence of transformers and LLMs in general, it's heavily specialized towards what's basically, AI inference as well as AI-oriented training chips. Currently, that's being accommodated by GPUs. We're going to see other types of chipsets emerge over time, but ultimately there is a whole different layer of compute management that's now involved as you're bringing these productions into scale. And then the third is the feedback loop itself. And it's something that I mentioned earlier in the use of a constitutional AI, for instance, to have an RLHF, but it turns out there are multiple ways to accommodate this important feedback loop. One is, of course, RLHF, which has been heavily used to improve model performance over time. So the difference between the hallucinations that, for instance, came out with GPT 3.5, as well as the evolution into GPT-4, what was the difference? It turns out the difference is in the introduction of RLHF, a reinforcement learning through human feedback, and that human feedback loop improved the model performance effectively over time. So what we're going to see is feedback loops continue to emerge as one of the dominant differences in machine learning versus some of the transformer-based work that we're seeing in the LLMs. And in those feedback loops, we'll see both human feedback loops, AI-based feedback loops, and human and AI feedback loops. And so that's an area that I'm pretty excited by from even an investment standpoint going into 2024.
And with that, and understanding now, kind of the overall landscape of LLMOps and how that's evolving, Nikhil, I'd be super curious to get your perspective on kind of, are there certain areas within the stack that you are most excited about or expect to become standalone businesses? And I know this is a debate in the kind of AI community broadly, and so would just be curious to get your perspective and where you land kind of in that debate.
And do you mean just in the AI stack overall, or as the AI stack as it relates to some of the regulatory issues that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, AI stack overall, but if there's references to kind of the regulatory landscape and responsible AI, super helpful as well.
I mean, I think for us as Insight, a lot of where we've been spending time is like, I think there's going to be incredible equity value. And if you switch back to slide, I can't remember the name right now, but that macro, I think there's going to be incredible equity value created in all parts of these stack. We've actually put little icons by some of the areas where we are maybe more excited to hunt and look at opportunities across the stack. And I think in part it's because the foundation models have, like OpenAI is a great example, have really scaled and become quite big businesses already. And I think in some ways some of the chess pieces there have been placed, and so there may not be as much opportunity to make net new investments for a venture capital investor, even though there's a lot of equity value being created there. So I think some of the areas where we've been focused, specialized or vertical LLMs, so companies that may own a unique set of data and can build upon that data to build an LLM that is differentiated and unique versus something that's completely horizontal in nature. I think personally there's a lot to do and look at in the application category. We have a hypothesis that whether it's a vertical application, something in life sciences or financial services, or kind of you name it, the list of vertical software companies that we would normally look at Insight, that there could be an AI native vertical software company built amongst this new paradigm shift. And similarly, there could be kind of a leading or scale several companies built across some of the horizontal categories like marketing, and we have 2 in our portfolio right now, or coding or design. I mentioned Wizard before. And then, I think the area in this tooling section is really interesting, and we're seeing a lot of company creation. And we're looking at spending time at a lot of these businesses, and we're excited about the tooling that's being built overall. We are also seeing a lot of I think creation and destruction already in the tooling segment, and in part that's because some of the players who are either incumbents or who are operating at the foundation model layer are building the tooling into their own offerings. So area of excitement for sure, but proceeding with some caution. I think one of the tooling areas that we're calling out as part of this presentation is the alignment, management, and safety tooling that help enterprises do responsible AI better. George mentioned it, but the companies that are net new best of breed players there right now are really taking the approach of helping give business leaders visibility into what's going on with their models and deployment of AI. I think increasingly that's going to have to shift to, well, as we are building models, like how do we day one be compliant with regulation?
Absolutely. And actually, that's an amazing segue to our final question, which is, with all of this, we've talked about risk, we've talked about the evolving regulatory landscape and the emerging solutions that are coming into the market because of that. John, I'd be super curious to get your thoughts on, so what should founders, do today to prepare for this wave of potential regulation and ensure that they're deploying AI responsibly going forward?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. It's hard to be forced to take a shot today without really knowing what you're aiming at. But there are some general guidance and principles that we've been sharing with our portfolio companies, that I've been coaching some of our portfolio companies through, from kind of a process and framework perspective, putting into play some approach for getting models and model use internally approved, creating a centralized list of approved platforms that everybody internally knows that they have access to and can use, building a process to evaluate legal issues, whether they be data privacy, intellectual property, confidentiality, distributing that guidance, like be it rules of the road or something more formal, so that everybody's crystal clear on exactly what you can and can't do internally in using these AI models. And I think also developing like some sort of a hotline or distribution list where people can easily contact members of the right team, so it's like an internal group think tank that can be standing at the ready to address these sorts of issues. Will really lay the foundation for success here. And then I'd also just add a few what I see as pretty clear do's and don'ts. And I think using these as kind of guiding principles will help most companies stay on the right side of the lines once they're ultimately drawn. To me, clear don'ts include things like putting confidential or proprietary data into public models. I think that's just a recipe for leaking things that you're either not legally permitted to share or that are so commercially sensitive that it could be quite damaging to share. Second, I'd say don't collect data to feed your models without the proper authorization. And on that, I also think that taking a sort of risk-based approach is particularly important. We discussed, and Nikhil discussed earlier, the difference between focusing on AI solutions within the product and within process automation and scaling the business more generally. And the former creates a lot more risk. If you're integrating AI solutions into your core product offering without fully understanding the intellectual property that's fed in, the contractual rights and risks, or how the data that's being ingested might have been tainted or unauthorized, you can create really fundamental risks to the viability of your product. Whereas I think on the scaling and efficiency side, probably the worst that happens is you just need to go back to the drawing board or go back to the old way you used to do things. So being really careful about what goes into the model and which places it's integrated into your business, and taking a risk-based approach there, I think is crucial. And then on my list of clear do's, I think testing out usage in lower risk areas first is a great suggestion. Rolling this out in an omnibus business-wide fashion without giving it a little bit of a test run in a lower risk area, I think can be a real mistake. Understanding the use and confirming consistent that the terms of use that you're entering into with whomever your model providers are is consistent with your use case before adopting a particular model is important. You'll need to, like I said, understand where your data was sourced, how it was sourced, and what rights you have to the outputs of these models. I think keeping good records as to what you've adopted in terms of AI governance, what you've adopted in terms of AI systems, how you vetted them, and how you've thought through these risks will do a lot of good in heading off any sort of future questions from regulators or issues that might come up in threatened litigation. That way, if and when those times come, you don't need to be scrambling to kind of rewrite history and how it all came together. And being transparent with stakeholders. If they're interacting with AI, just tell them they're interacting with AI. That seems like a pretty clear principle that's been adopted in a number of different legislative proposals to date. Understanding your liability exposure. I know that we can't understand it to a T, but getting a sense for exactly where the potential risks lie and thinking through the question of if there was a liability scheme that that put the burden on me as the user to ensure the accuracy or the legality, whatever I'm doing with this AI model. Would I be ready to stand behind that from a business risk perspective? And then I think also getting to counsel. This is a really quickly changing area of the law, and before we even get clear legislation and regulation in this space, we need to operate today under the laws that we have, and that takes a lot of difficult judgment calls. And so working, whether it's with your in-house counsel or with an outside firm that's well versed in these areas and is good at making those sorts of risk-based commercial judgments as to how you should proceed in the face of this sort of an uncertainty, I think will be a big differentiator.
Super valuable. And I know this is a big topic. So for anyone going to scale up, we will be covering this topic in even more detail. George, do you have additional kind of points here that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, John actually really covered this section quite well. I do think that as we're seeing the regulation continue to evolve, it's an important topic for anyone who's a founder, builder, as well as a larger enterprise that's bringing AI solutions to market, AI-based underpin solutions to market, to really be aware, right? And I think in that regard, there are good providers of solutions, particularly in the alignment, trust, safety space that Nikhil and I covered earlier, that'll also sort of help you in that journey. But I think this is a moment where it is critical to pay attention to what's happening among these regulatory bodies, as well as John indicated, in Congress, because the rules of engagement are being defined as we speak. And it's important that we participate in the definition of these rules as they're coming about.
Makes sense. And so I guess now, as we think about some of the QA questions that came in, and really appreciate everyone sending across questions both live during this webinar as well as before. One thing that has stood out and was a very common question was, I'm a founder, great advice in terms of do's and don'ts. How do I, though, stay up to date given the regulatory space is so complex and evolving all the time? Would love to get all of your perspectives on that.
John, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. It may be easiest to just share some resources with the group after this. There's definitely a handful I know I use. I kind of bucket them into a few different categories in terms of focus and depth of detail. For just broad-based AI regulation legislation, honestly, you're not going to miss it. If Congress adopts a comprehensive AI regulatory scheme, you will see that. And so at a really broad level, and the EU AI Act has also been very closely followed by almost every major news publication. So at a very high level, I think just staying on top of the typical news media sources will be a good resource and probably give you most of the detail that you need as a founder. And I think a lot of that detail will be talk to a lawyer, because there's no amount of coverage that will substitute for good counsel once we get a lot of definition around what exactly is called for here. And then jumping down like maybe a layer deeper, I think law firms do a fairly good job at following these regulations. Cooley and Debevoise, for example, they publish, and a number of other law firms publish client memos and alerts and the like, which will not only alert you to the fact that something is changing within the legal and regulatory space here, but also provide some pretty thoughtful analysis and insights as to how that might apply to your business in particular. And then lastly, I see a lot of AI legislation and regulation trackers. those don't have the benefit of providing that sort of in-depth analysis and professional insights that a law firm memo would, but they're very real time, they're very comprehensive, and they, if in particular, if you're a lawyer trying to track this stuff yourself, they're probably the raw data source that will be most useful to ensuring that nothing slips by. And then once you see something on the tracker that you think could be potentially relevant to you, you can then dig in and try and find resources that expand your understanding of it.
Mm-hmm.
Jenna, I was going to say totally agree with John, and it would echo some of the legal resources that he provided. I think this issue, though, is certainly an issue of legal, but it's also an issue of ethics and sentiment. And so, especially in that technical and social bucket, understanding how people broadly are approaching these issues and how they're thinking about them and how your customers feel about them, I think is going to be important in how you think about developing and safeguarding all the practices that are important in responsible AI.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that there's also something of a boomerang effect there, where the things that the community is viewing as most ethically and ethically valuable and the best practices of responsible AI may well be baked back into any legislation and regulation that's adopted, because they are the ones who are actually doing the legislating and regulating are keeping their ear to the ground and are aware of the best practices that are developing.
Super helpful. Another really interesting Q&A question that came in, that's almost a kind of a different angle on founder advice, is, if you are a founder, and it's kind of, they called it the 800-pound gorilla question, that where, if you have a great angle on a market within AI, what prevents the large players, OpenAI and other foundation models, from noticing and throwing their resources at it and then launching a similar product? Is the domain model the kind of defensibility there, or how do you think about differentiation and long-term durability of those types of companies?
Yeah, it was a great question that was asked, Jenna, and I would say the domain specific model is one piece of the puzzle of maintaining defensibility. I think when you layer in the domain specific model with ideally a source of private data and providing a compelling user experience as far as particularly applications go, and of course, kind of embedding into the workflow of that domain that you're providing a solution towards, that's when you tend to have a fair degree of stickiness and a bit of a moat from anyone else sort of entering that market. I think what's really challenging, and I'm sure Nikhil has some great points on this as well, is that the incumbents are moving pretty quickly, right? So this is the moment that we're seeing in the market where the incumbents are innovating as fast as folks that are, getting themselves started in any particular software domain. And so part of this is just going to be, you're going to have to not only move quickly, but you're going to have to move in a way that the experience itself is ultimately going to have to be 10x better than what's the status quo. And the status quo is a moving target right now, just because the incumbents are innovating very fast. So it's, I would say, harder to disrupt a category that's being AI enabled now, because the incumbents themselves are AI enabling themselves. Nikhil, I'm sure you have some more thoughts too.
Yeah, I think George said it really nicely. Like this, as opposed to maybe some other shifts, you have a set of companies that maybe have data and distribution advantages, and if they are tech native or AI native in kind of their structure, like they could be formidable competitors. I do not think that means that there's not an opportunity for net new companies to come in and create and compete. And I think we've seen that, across every innovation cycle that we've experienced. I think some specific ways I think about that happening are, let's say, AI native companies that are being built in verticals. Verticals like healthcare, verticals like financial services, or verticals like the long tail of vertical software that just serve, let's say, a more niche or specific customer. And if you can serve that customer better and you can acquire the data and distribution advantage, I think that's a way or path to build kind of an AI native best of breed company of scale that can compete with an incumbent. I think part of why we are pushing some urgency around thinking about generative AI is because your competitors are thinking about it. And so if you're not incorporating, we started with the product and scaling frameworks, and I think we're adding to this the responsibility frameworks. You are at risk of getting disrupted because the evolution is happening really, really quickly.
Totally. Super interesting. And I'm going to move over to the last question that we can go to for the day. Really appreciate all the questions. I know there's a lot more to talk about. And so the good news is we are talking more about this topic at Scale Up if anyone is joining. But for the last question of the day, we talked about reinforcement learning. One question that came in was, how can we select a workforce for reinforcement learning that minimizes regional and cultural biases? And, thinking about the risks we talked about in the first part of today, I think this really speaks to kind of 2 and 3. So would love to get your perspective on this.
One of the things that we noticed, particularly around the systems that were built in the last, sort of 2-3 years or so, is the likelihood that risk around bias and fairness was pretty significant, and you had a challenge in terms of how much bias can be introduced in the system, and a lot of that came down to how well diversified your training data was, and how you were able to get a very broad set of diverse training data to build your models. I think this is also going to be similarly the case with a question around particularly a human feedback loop, as well as potentially an AI feedback loop. So in the reinforcement learning side of the world, you almost have to have a diverse capability of who's providing your feedback, right? And that has to be sort of somewhat more diversified than a smaller, call it, population or segment. That's a lot easier to do in consumer grade applications, but oftentimes it's much trickier to get right in enterprise applications. So this is a live topic that will be of a serious concern and interest, particularly going into 2024, as enterprise applications will need better feedback loops around RLHF. And so that's where we're kind of excited to see both solutions emerge, but also just iteration among the builders themselves in terms of how they're approaching this question.
Awesome. Well, I'm cognizant we are 1 minute to 3, so that will be kind of the end of our discussion today, but just want to thank all of you for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience and, apprising on this really top of mind topic for so many founders in the space. And thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate you all dialing in, and hope to see you at another webinar throughout the year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
everyone. Thanks, Jenna.
Thanks, Jenna.